I'm Andrew Schwartz, and you're listening to The Truth of the Matter, a podcast by CSIS where we break down the top policy issues of the day and talk with the people that can help us best understand what's really going on. To get to the truth of the matter and to preview the upcoming NATO summit, we have with us our amazing Russia and Eurasia and Europe program director, Max Bergmann. Max, you're always one of my favorite podcast guests on Truth of the Matter. I want to ask you right out, what do you see as the main goal of this NATO summit? I mean, there is a lot of fraught business out there going on that NATO has its tentacles into. What do you think is the main goal, and how will it be advanced in this summit?
Well, Andrew, great to be with you. Thanks for having me. I think the main goal, first of all, is to celebrate that NATO has been around for 75 years. This is a birthday party. This is a big deal celebration. And I think it's to sort of take stock of the alliance. And I think what you're going to hear is a lot of rhetoric, a lot of photo ops. Maybe there'll be a birthday cake, but highlighting that the argument will be made that NATO is stronger than ever. NATO expanded. Sweden and Finland have joined the alliance. And that is quite significant in sort of filling what was a real sort of hole in European security, particularly in the Baltics, where what would we have done if Finland was ever attacked again by the Russians or Sweden? And that was a big question. I think we would have acted, but now we know we will act. NATO will act. They are in the alliance. The other thing I think we'll hear a lot about is that NATO is getting its act together. You know, the Europeans that we have been slamming justifiably for their lack of spending on defense are now spending on defense. The increases in defense spending are rather remarkable, where more than 20 countries, and it can get up to, I think, 28 countries, according to NATO numbers, are approaching 2%, or hitting 2% defense spending. So we're seeing...
Which is where they're supposed to be.
Which is where they're supposed to be, which is, you know, where kind of a responsible country that's taking their security obligations to the alliance seriously will spend. And so that's significant. So there's a lot more combat power coming to the alliance. And then, of course, there's Ukraine. And I think what the White House will seek to do is use the summit to really demonstrate a degree of solidarity with Ukraine. We can maybe talk about that. And I think there's one last thing, and it's that there's going to be a new Secretary General, and it's going to be Mark Rutte, the Dutch Prime Minister, who is now the outgoing Dutch Prime Minister. It has been Jens Stoltenberg for about a decade. Sort of
feels like more than a decade.
Yeah, the job has a little bit been like Hotel California for Jens. He could enter, he could become SecGen, but could never leave.
Never leave.
We'll have a new head of NATO. Rutte won't take office until October, but that has been formalized, and that will be, I think, highlighted at the summit.
So let's talk about Finland and Sweden. What will these new members of NATO bring to the summit? It's pretty exciting for them.
Yeah, I mean, these are, you know, two very important countries, especially Finland in terms of its military capacity and military readiness. I mean, this is a country that was neutral and wasn't actually expecting or depending on other countries to come to its defense. It was preparing itself to fight the Russians if it need be. And so incredibly capable military actor with deep levels of societal resilience, real lessons, not just for other NATO partners, but also for some of our Asian allies, like Asian partners such as Taiwan, can learn lots of lessons from Finland. And then Sweden, one of the wealthiest and most populous Nordic countries, also has a thriving defense industry. Now, Sweden did take a bit of a holiday from defense spending, but since Russia's invasion of Ukraine the first time in 2014, Swedish defense spending has significantly increased. So a very serious defense actor, and one that's actually pivotal to, I think, Baltic security, given Sweden's position, both in the Baltic and being next to Norway and with the Malmo Straits with Denmark.
The Finns bring a pretty strong military, right?
Yeah.
Swedes developing, not as strong, but like you said, really developing. They're major assets, aren't they?
They're major assets to the alliance. And I think not just in the deterring Russia. We have seen Finland, for instance, participate in EU operations in the Sahel. So this is a country that is willing to demonstrate its solidarity with its European partners. I think the other thing to highlight here is that what it does is also make the NATO-EU relationship more simpatico. Because now, really, membership of the EU is almost identical to NATO. Now, there's some countries that aren't in, Ireland, Austria, Malta, and Cyprus, but that's less than 5% of the EU's population. So we're talking 95% of the EU's population is in NATO. And I think that leads to hopefully more synergies between NATO and the European Union.
So that brings me to the point of of course, the possibility of Ukraine joining NATO as a major focus. So the first question I have is, what does this debate look like now? And, on a forthcoming podcast for Truth of the Matter, I spoke with Ambassador Stu Eisenstadt, who has a new book out called The Art of Diplomacy. And he was telling me that Ukraine simply joining the European Union makes it a lot harder for Russia to attack Ukraine or to continue to wage this war. What do you think about that equation?
So I think this whole thing, right, this whole fight between Ukraine and Russia emerged in 2014, actually in 2013. And it's about Ukraine having a European future.
And it emerged then because Ukraine was told that if they gave up their nuclear weapons and Russia agreed to this, that they would be left alone.
Yeah. And so there's been a long struggle, or since Ukraine gained its independence from Russia after the end of the Cold War, of Ukraine being stuck between two paths, a path toward Moscow or a path towards Europe. And what the Ukrainian people want is a path towards Europe. And then sometimes, the people that least appreciate the European Union are oftentimes the Europeans inside the European Union, but the Europeans outside the European Union. You see this in Tbilisi in Georgia, but particularly in Ukraine, really get that it matters to be in the EU. It matters to have that European future, to have that EU flag flying next to the flag of your capital. So Ukraine wants that EU future. And the question is, can it get it without NATO membership? When the European Union expanded 20 years ago in 2004 and brought in countries of Eastern Europe into the European Union, well, those countries had already joined NATO, were already NATO members. So NATO provided the security umbrella to bring these countries in. And so part of Ukraine desperation to be part of NATO is the sense that that will give the security umbrella for it to join the European Union. Now, no one has had as tricky a situation as Ukraine. Obviously, it's fighting a war. Lots of its territory is being occupied by Russia. But there is a path for Ukraine, I think, to join the European Union, potentially without NATO membership, but it will be difficult. And it will require Ukraine, I think, to make either real battlefield gains or at the very least deter Russia from striking Ukrainian-held territory, and to kind of have essentially a solid frozen conflict, so to speak, where that would enable Ukraine to turn towards Europe. But yes, it is paramount. I mean, the way Ukraine wins this war is not by taking back another 50 kilometers. The way Ukraine wins this war is that it's in the European Union. And I think that's the end goal. And whether you need NATO for that or whether Ukraine can simply deter Russia on its own with other security agreements with countries like the United States, which we just signed, I think Ukrainians could be open to that. But the goal for Ukraine is the EU membership, is to be able to be part of the European Union and all that comes with it, from not only the economic growth that comes from that, but just socially, people being able to travel around the European Union, your kids being able to study wherever they want. I mean, there's real benefits that come from being a European Union citizen, and that's something that the Ukrainians are desperate for.
So, Max, I want to ask, given that whole scenario, when you think about what the end to this Ukraine-Russia war might look like, is Ukraine open to giving away some of the territory that's been taken in order for them to enter the EU and survive and get Russia off their back? Are they open to any concessions?
So I think we're not there yet. And you're not going to pre-announce concessions that you're willing or ready to make until there's a serious negotiation. Sure. And what's clear is that there's no serious negotiation. The Russians are not serious about negotiating. And we can tell that because Putin's demands are that Ukraine give up territory that it currently possesses. So I think what Ukraine needs to do and how we need to think about this war is that the Ukrainians need to make Russia want this war to end. And the way that happens is that Ukraine continues to fight back and continues to cause real damage to the Russian military and show Russia that there's no future for them continuing this war and that Ukraine has no choice but to keep fighting. I am a little bit more optimistic than most. I think a long war can favor Ukraine. They have to mobilize their population. They have to continue to get arms from the US. They, have a defense industry, but the defense industry is also being pummeled by Russian missile attacks. So they're really dependent on us providing support.
And the Europeans. So, Max, at this NATO summit, I'm assuming that the Europeans and the United States and our allies are all going to really reaffirm their support for Ukraine. Is that the case?
Yes. And so what we're going to see at this NATO summit is, I think, something quite impactful, right? The focus has been on NATO membership. Will the U.S. offer an invitation? The answer is the U.S. is not going to offer an invitation for Ukraine to join. If it was so hard to get Sweden and Finland in, getting Ukraine in, right now while it's at war, it's not going to happen. And I get why people are focused on that because it's symbolically important. But what really matters here, I think, are the bilateral security agreements that countries like the United States, the UK, and others have inked with Ukraine that commit to a long-term security partnership with Ukraine, to come to Ukraine's aid, to be there for Ukraine. And I think we're going to see those agreements be formed into something like a Ukraine compact that will be a real focal point of the solidarity of the alliance behind Ukraine.
Can you explain what the European pillar concept is and how it could shape NATO's agenda?
So the European pillar is a concept that is being revived. And I think this is something that the United States needs to take quite seriously. It's something we at CSIS have put out a number of reports. Last year, we had a big report on how to transform European defense. Look, the United States, on the one hand, really likes the status quo. We really actually like the fact that Europe is full of fairly weak militaries that are fully dependent on the United States to provide security for them, because it allows us to sort of call the shots in Europe. We're the quarterback for European defense, and the Europeans then oftentimes do what we ask them to do on foreign policy issues. Gives us a lot of influence. On the other hand, we have a real problem, and that is China. And that is the challenge that China poses to the U.S. military. And now we have this real problem of Russia having recapitalized its defense industry, potentially reconstituting its forces much faster than we expected. So we have faced these twin threats. So to have Europe not really be able to defend itself is a problem. So I think what needs to begin to happen is we need to begin a transition where the Europeans are increasingly able to defend themselves and are able to act more as Europe. Europe is integrated in every way possible except for defense, in part because we have told the Europeans not to. And I think it's time for us to sort of reverse that policy that we sort of set during the Clinton administration of the EU shouldn't duplicate NATO. This is not about the EU creating its own army. This is about using the integrative powers of the European Union, particularly when it comes to the defense industrial side, the EU's ability to raise revenue and funding, to do joint things. There are so many gaps in European military capabilities like airlift and air tankers and other big ticket items that all these European militaries can't afford on their own and rely on the United States.
Right. So we're talking about real economic security here.
Yeah, we're talking about Europe taking action, being responsible for itself through NATO. NATO would still be the combatant command effectively for Europe, and it would still be the principal venue to tie the US and Europe together. And so getting there is going to be a long slog. This is not something like, oh, we just pull out of NATO or pull back and then Europeans will just step up. No, this is like a generational effort, but I think it's something that we need to begin to drive Europe toward. So great, Europe is spending more on defense, but now's the time to think about, as Europe rebuilds its military capacity, to not to have all these, more than 27 different countries go in individual directions, but to actually work together.
Max, changing gears a bit, it's hard to not think about the recent European elections when you're thinking about NATO and this summit. There's clearly been a rightward turn. It's on people's minds. What impact will the recent Euro elections have on NATO?
So this is a great question. And I think the answer is we don't quite know yet, because the French are having an election. Their first round is Sunday. I think in general, actually, some of the lessons from the European parliamentary elections were that the far right performed well in France and Germany, but not that well in the rest of Europe. And actually the center held. And when I look at the EU, what I actually see is, with the likelihood that Ursula von der Leyen, who has a great relationship with Joe Biden and with this administration, and I think would have a good relationship potentially with any administration, is focusing more on defense. The EU is going to be focused much more on defense. And why? Because the EU is focused on European security, whether that's economic, whether that's climate, but increasingly that's going to be on defense. So I think we're going to see a stronger EU role, especially on the defense industrial side. The question is, how much money will the EU actually have to spend? And that's, I think, a big open question. There is an issue, though, with the French elections, that if the far right comes to power or paralyzes the French government or paralyzes the European Union or paralyzes France's ability to act at NATO or other places, that could cause real havoc. I'm a tad more optimistic. I think one of the things that we're actually seeing in Europe is the far right wanting power. And in recognizing they want power, they have moved more to the center. So you had all this fear over Giorgia Meloni when she won the Italian elections. Here's someone from a far-right party with fascist roots. Oh my God, what does this mean for the future of Europe? And then what we find out is that Meloni is actually strongly transatlanticist, has backed Ukraine. Now, the National Rally in France, are different.
But it's not Marine Le Pen's father's party anymore.
It's not that. There's still a lot of questions, right? The one thing, we're about to have a presidential debate here in the United States, or I'm sure when this podcast comes out, it'll have already happened.
Yes, it will.
But the French are having this parliamentary debate between a prime minister who's in his early 30s and the far-right National Rally, Jordan Bardella, and he's 28 years old.
28.
I mean, it's sort of like should be a policy analyst here at CSIS.
I'm surprised he's not. I mean, he does cuts a great dashing figure, but right. I mean, he's 28.
So, but you have this, I think, a dynamic situation in French politics. It's going to be somewhat of a mess. On the other hand, all this doomsday I see on Twitter, one thing I would say is the real danger here is paralysis in Europe.
Because do these people realize that Macron still has 3 more years?
Yeah,
He's not going anywhere.
Now, there's some implications of what this could mean on how Macron could actually operate, but paralysis is literally how the United States government operates legislatively for 80% of the time. So European governance is actually incredibly effective. They pass so many laws at the European level. So we might see a slowing down of that. That might impact NATO in terms of maybe defense spending, perhaps support for Ukraine. It's not great, but the jury's still out, and we have to see how these elections play out.
Max, this is terrific. Thank you for this primer on the summit. Really appreciate your time. We will be discussing this a lot in the weeks and months to come. So thank you.
Thanks so much for having me. And hopefully all the Europeans will survive the DC heat in July.
Oh, man. It's going to be tough for them.
It's going to be tough.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. From Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, AIDS 2020, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog.